We're moving right along in this series that we're going through called Thriving in Community. We're moving so along because we started it in September. But one of the things we talked about is that when we're going through this Thriving in Community, it's about talking about 4 ingredients that are very, very helpful in growing a thriving and healthy community. And so we've talked about joy. We've talked about hesed, or attachment love. And right now we're talking about what this 3rd ingredient is. And it's really important to remember it's not like we talked about joy, we're done with joy, we leave joy, moving on to the next one. It's an ingredient that all together, when they mixed in with all the ingredients together, that's when you get this whole idea of a thriving community. That's where we become really, really healthy. And so right now we're in group identity. And this group identity is basically the idea of how we interact with each other, with God, and ultimately with all those around us. And we've been talking about how this happens on the right side of the brain, which is the side of the brain that is faster than cognitive thought. And so it becomes more and more natural. And how we grow into it is not just by merely kind of the information transfer like we're doing right now, but it actually comes with the idea of demonstration. When we see our people acting in a certain way, we see that it becomes locked into our brain. We see it more and more often, and we start to do it. It very much happens when we have our families. How many of us, I know I've done this, when you kind of growing up, your parents do a certain thing, you're like, I'm never doing that when I get that age. And then, when you get to that age, you become horrified when you're like, that sounded like my mom, or that sounded like my dad. That's because that became the group identity. You watched them do it, and it kind of became that. It's not just sort of like, though this can be true, it's not like once you go when you're a kid and you're like, why would they ever do that? And then when you're a parent, you're like, oh, that's why. That maybe made a little sense, but a lot of it sometimes is because that's what you've watched. There are times when I used to really be annoyed at a certain voice my dad would make when playing with kids. And then when I hit kids, all of a sudden I would say it, I'd be like, oh my gosh, that was my dad. It just becomes such a natural thing. Well, that's kind of what it's like. Group identity gets developed in community through family, but through community like this. It's not just once you have that family, because no matter how good our family is, we can pick up some negative places because we're all people on the journey of growth. And what happens is in the community, we learn from each other. We get to model each other. Even more importantly in this group identity, because it's founded on Jesus, we model him. We basically, character traits are modeled and transformed as we emulate Jesus more. That's why in the very first time we talked about in this group identity, Pastor Ron talked about the importance of reading our Bible. One of those importance, reading our Bible, especially the Gospels, is that we know Jesus more. We see him interact. And we become more and more as we become more familiar with him. As we become in relationship with him, it helps us to emulate him. So beyond that, we've also covered so far compassion. We've covered kindness. And today, we're going to talk about humility. Now, this was actually an interesting thing when I just started diving into it, I was thinking about it, studying it a little bit. Found out this: humility is a very popular thing to talk about, more so than to truly live it out. We sometimes talk way more about how humble we are than we actually are humble. In fact, where the humility, which again is sometimes popular talked about, but not so much lived out, has caused Richard J. Foster wrote a book last year on humility. And it's actually interesting what his subtitle was. It was Learning Humility, a Year of Searching for a Vanishing Virtue. And as I dove into a little bit of what he wrote and other sociologists and philosophers wrote, they actually said our culture right now is more of a breeding ground for arrogance, selfishness, and narcissism. Humility is seen more as weakness than a true virtue. Again, we talk about it very highly, but practicing it is not something we do a whole lot. In fact, Richard J. Foster in that book says, the call to humility has been too little regarded in the church because its true nature and importance has been too little apprehended. Now, what's really interesting is if you actually do a little bit more history, as much as we can kind of rail on this culture for maybe not taking humility serious and being more of a place that fosters things like selfishness and arrogance, it really hasn't necessarily been a whole lot better. In fact, if you go back to Jesus' times in the ancient Greek culture, it wasn't popular either. It was actually Jesus who kind of turned this whole thing around. You know, it's Jesus who would teach that he came to serve and not be served. That would have been quite a message from somebody who would be considered a leader, who would have been thought of as a king, to do a message that I did not come to be served, but I came to serve. That would have been foreign. In fact, it's kind of even foreign now. But Jesus spoke about it a lot. It actually would cause Paul, hearing of the stories of Jesus, to write this: you must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took up the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death, on the cross. It makes you wonder all of the things that Paul would have heard about in Jesus from the other apostles, from other followers that followed him, because there were other beyond just those 12. The stories he would have heard, the times in prayer that he would have been affected by Jesus. That this would have been a model, more so than Jesus that one time said, I came to serve, not to be served. There's something greater and deeper. And I think what caused Paul to write this is these stories that he would have heard. And I want to break this down, and I'm going to borrow from Richard J. Foster in some of this breakdown. One, Jesus had a humble birth in an obscure village. Two, he grew up in quiet obscurity that would actually cause Nathanael, a disciple, to respond when told that Jesus was from Nazareth, to say, what good can come from Nazareth? Because that wasn't the place where if you wanted to be a mover and shaker, that you would say you came from there. In fact, you probably relocated. They said, they're like, well, I really came from this place, Jerusalem. Or this place. What good can come there? His teachings were often directed for those who would be considered lower on the social ladder or outcasts completely. He would spend a lot of time with those who were lower on the social ladder. So he's not building himself currency by going and hanging out and having dinner with some of these people. In fact, it would sound like he would doing worse for himself, because he would do, in the eyes of the social society, because of who he was hanging out with. He spent a lot of time ministering in the more obscure areas, not the prominent areas, the major hubs. Like if you want to be a mover and shaker, if you look through the Gospels, you read through that, you thought he would have got to Jerusalem a whole lot sooner than that. But he was in Galilee. That's the backwater. That's the blue-collar workers. Those aren't the highly educated. Those aren't the political people going into the major areas. Those aren't the people who have a voice to society. His disciples that he chose, they were not of high position, status, or title. They were far from first-round draft picks. He would actually teach a lot about humility. Matthew 23, he has a strong word for about some of the religious leaders in verse 11. It says, the greatest among you must be a servant. But those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Yeah, he said that to the religious leaders. He said very similar things to his own followers. When they would entertain delusions of grandeur, he would kind of lead them back. You see this in Mark 10:42. When he says, you know that the rulers of this world lord it over their people, and the officials flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you, it'll be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be a servant. And whoever wants to be the first among you must be a slave to everyone else. And then he would demonstrate it. In John 13, I believe, when he talked about there's the washing of the feet of the disciples, where he takes a servant role. Richard Foster would actually add this, and he said that Jesus absolutely drew a crowd. And what he says we should note is how he handles the fame, that he handles it without manipulation, without control, and without domination. That's a big thing. If we can see someone who is successful as well as humble. Because again, sometimes they don't come together. And I mean really successful. Sometimes humility is not there. So when we see someone who is very successful, and you see that humility, that's someone to watch. One of the people that I actually heard about in a few different things I read was a doctor by the name of Paul Brandt, who's a leprosy doctor. Very successful in helping those with leprosy. One of the leading in his field. And time after time, when you read about him, these people speak of his humility. He did it because he desired to help those people thrive in the midst of their disease. That was the most important thing to him. Here's the other thing. We actually talked about this, Ron and I talked about this in our video on kindness. But this also talks about humility. Jesus was interruptible. I mean, he was speaking to a lot of people. He had crowds following him. Yet there were so many times when someone called out, got his attention. He stopped and he paid attention, interacted with them, healed them, went to supper with them. He was interruptible. And ultimately that he went to the cross for the sins of the world. When we see kind of humility, the idea of demonstrated by Jesus, it starts to dispel some myths. And that is things like humility is full of strength. It's just strength without domination. That it is absolutely, humility is full of courage. It's just without self-centeredness or self-promoting arrogance. When we see that the foundation of humility is Jesus, we start to see what it can look like. So it's really important that we kind of maybe start to unpack some ideas when it comes to humility. If we see it through Jesus, and we see how Jesus came down to earth, and in coming down to earth, interacted with not just the people, the high people. He did interact with Pharisees. He interacted with religious leaders, but went out of his way to act with those on the lower social level, those who were outcasts. One thing we learn about humility is the humility, when we have truly have it, allows us to see the worth of others. Because it takes the focus off of self. We see the people. And so we become a people who are. Or a people who see people. A people who value others. And humility helps us doing that. Now, what's really kind of cool is if we go back to the kind of the Latin root of humility. It actually means to be of the earth or grounded. So of the earth or grounded. This gives us, again, a kind of a great understanding of kind of humility, especially when we think of the word grounded. Let's unpack that. When someone is grounded, we think of there's someone who's of peace. We say maybe there's someone who's stable. Maybe someone who's ultimately self-aware. Just a grounded person. Self-awareness is a huge part of what humility is. When someone is self-aware, it means that they are seeing themselves truly as they are. They're not seeing themselves as an overinflated sense of self or self-importance or self-interest. So selfishness, arrogance, and narcissism. We can kind of focus on that whole idea. It's not an overinflated sense of self. Equally, it's not an underinflated sense of self. Again, we look at Jesus, there was no point where he was saying like, I'm not that great. I'm really awful. No, he didn't think of himself too great that he said, I can't hang out with you. I can't talk to you. I can't interact with you. But he fully knew who he was. Because sometimes I think we kind of do that when we think of humility. It's more about self-deprecation or an over-focus on self-deprecation, that we lower ourselves way more than we should. Right? So humility is that we shouldn't inflate ourselves more than we should. We also shouldn't lower ourselves more than we should. Yes, it's about being honest in our weaknesses. Or as Michael Hendricks says in the book, The Other Half of Church, we become aware of our malfunctions when we forget to act like ourselves. We become aware of our immaturities or where our character needs growing. But it's not about lowering ourselves where we shouldn't. It's still about valuing ourselves. It's not about undervaluing ourselves. In fact, when we start to do that, that's a false sense of humility. Dr. Jim Wilder actually talks about this kind of false sense of humility, this false sense of humility that runs wild, that where we lower ourselves too much. It can actually lead to another kind of narcissism. And he breaks down two kind of narcissisms. He says there's a peacock. Pretty sure we have a pretty good idea when we even say peacock. Or there's skunk. What the skunk does is he basically beats themselves down in order to, really important, because sometimes we beat ourselves down because of our hurts and all that sort of stuff, but in order to elicit responses from other people to tell them how wonderful they are. That's a skunk narcissist. Now again, not saying, because sometimes we get down, sometimes because our hurts, those are real, and I'm not saying that, if you do that, you can't talk about it. Yes, you can. But when we do it to elicit responses of praises from other people, that's our motivation. Dr. Jim Wilder, who's a psychologist, says this is just a different form of narcissism. We're not seeing people. They're a commodity. We're using people at that point. See, when we see our weaknesses, when we might be a little down on ourselves and failures, we're hopefully sharing those to be just simply honest with the desire of help me grow. Don't just tell me how wonderful I am, but I want to grow. When we see other people and we share that with people, hopefully there are people that, hey, I'm sharing with this because I see some strength in you that I don't have, and I could really use your help in building it up. That's that group identity. I start to see that. I've seen you demonstrate things, and therefore I want to grow. So it's not about beating myself up so you just tell me how wonderful I am. It's about being honest and saying, I'm feeling pretty low, and that person say, let me help you. calling for help is really important and very humble. Because sometimes our pride, when we start to think like, oh, they want to help me. No. Humility says, I need help. I can't do this by myself. And I'm seeing people in my community who are demonstrating strengths that I could really use, that I maybe don't have. Maybe I didn't witness in my formative years of growing up, and I could really use that. Because in that with humility, you start to see the person and you see their strengths. You are valuing and respecting that person because you're saying that you have something that can help me grow, and I really could use that. Because one of the key aspects of humility is teachability. When we are not teachable, we lack humility. We need to be teachable. We need to be able to learn. That helps us go from being honest in our weakness and our malfunctions to a desire to grow and strengthen what those can look like. Also, when we are teachable, we start to see people. Being teachable is an amazing way to see people. Many of you have met my brother. He's special needs. If you can get past his latest obsession, and he will talk your ear off about it, relentlessly, and when you think he's done, he's only just begun. And he won't stop. But when you can get past that, and he's easy to dismiss, he sometimes will say something that's utterly profound. When we're humble, when we've got humility, and we're teachable, be surprised at some of the things that we can learn from people that we can easily dismiss. Sometimes we're dismissing it because maybe they just don't have the experience you've had. Maybe because, well, you're an expert in your field, but they might have something that you never even thought of, just because there's something actually sometimes where we're humbled when sometimes there's some amazing, unique perspectives that come from limitations. It's actually phenomenal. When we grow in our humility and our ability to see ourselves, our strengths, successes, talents, giftings, we see those. But here's the thing. We see them honestly. We don't see them with the benefit of our own personal glorification. When we see with humility and through the lens of Jesus, we aren't blinded by our inflated self so that we can start to see those who are truly around us. In fact, when we lack humility, it's like we have an obstructed view of whatever we're looking at. Have you ever been to a concert? In a standing room over only? Courtney and I were one just a couple months ago. And you think when you stand in that spot, you're like, this seems to be pretty good. Good view of the concert. And I mean, I'm not the tallest guy, but I'm far from short. And the 6'5" person somehow finds their way in front of you wearing a big hat. It was a big hat. So much so that you can never fully see the stage. If you want to look at the guitar player on this side, you got to lean this way. You want to look at the other guys on this side, you got to lean this way. Well, that's exactly what it is when we don't have humility and arrogance starts to get in the way. It's like an obstruction view, but we aren't trying to even look around the hat anymore because the obstructed view is you. And oh, are you a big fan of you? And we get caught up in that. which goes beyond even arrogance into narcissism. When it comes to peacock narcissism, when you think you are the best, or you move into that entitlement that comes with it, and there is no humility, how do you see people? Everybody's a pawn. One of the things we talked about with joy, how you have joy, and joy helps us process this thing called shame, process it healthily. Narcissists, this is what Dr. Jim Wilder says, narcissists, they are entitled and they think life should be without any kind of discomfort or shame or pain. And so they avoid it or deflect it. Kind of like this. You tell a joke. Sure, we all been here. I've definitely been here. That joke doesn't land so good, it actually offends somebody. You can respond with, it's just a joke. You can't take a joke. That's deflection. You were offended, but it's not my fault, it's your fault. That's your fault, not mine. Now imagine that in business. Something goes wrong. It's not my fault, it's your fault. Right? Everyone becomes a pawn to make themselves good and to deflect from anything negative or bad because they are great and wonderful. When we add humility, we move away from self-justification. So one of the things actually Michael Hendricks will write about in that book, The Other Half of Church, we are a people who do not self-justify. The self-justification is all about deflection. It's not my fault, it's your fault. I didn't do anything bad, you did it bad. Something went wrong, it wasn't me, it was you. You need to figure that out. Humility, there is explanation, which can sound somewhat similar. It might sound like, I meant that as a joke. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I won't say something like that again. You owned it. Yeah, you didn't mean it. But you're feeling that shame of like, I hurt that person and I didn't want to. You process it healthily. Now, it's really important with humility because it's really important that we can hear this idea that we can't somehow praise strengths and giftings and accomplishments and all that sort of stuff. Absolutely you can. Humility isn't that doesn't exist, which is, again, I think sometimes a mistakenness when it comes to humility. It's not that they don't exist. It's this. You can speak of those same things with gratefulness. We talked about, again, earlier last year, at the end of last year, having gratitude lists. When you have a success, you can be really thankful for all those who've helped you in that. I started doing a list with doing a lot of music and enjoying music and having some giftings in music, writing a list of people who really helped me along the way. And it's okay to note that something like whatever you might have or whatever I have, like say a gifting of music, to note the gratefulness of there are so many people that I can, on my list, that helped me, that grew me, that I learned from, that I am better because of. And I'm grateful for that. So we don't want to be dodgers. We are a people who don't self-justify. Even if the thing wasn't your fault, you can learn from it. Humility says, okay, I wasn't do that, I didn't do that, but what can I learn from that? What can I learn from that miscommunication that happened there so that I can communicate better next time? It's humility. Because again, when it comes to humility, if humility isn't practiced, We have a blurred view of people. We only see them in the context of our needs. So we only see them through the lens of ourselves. We can give the appearance or the illusion of seeing people, but all you have to look behind is to see all the dead bodies that lay back there. We can have the appearance of humility, but when we want to see the fruit of humility, it's that we truly see and value the people around us. This is what we see Jesus did. Right before Paul would write, we did it earlier in Philippians 2, he would write this: don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out for your own interests. Don't look out for your own interests, but take an interest in others too. Then from that, he would launch into take on the attitude of Christ. If this isn't clear, let me make it clear. That's what Paul did. If you understand what I mean by this, look at Jesus and look what he did. It's not about devaluing yourself. It's about truly valuing others. It's not about not knowing what your strengths or giftings or successes are. It's simply not focusing on how they elevate you, but starting to focus on how they could benefit those around you. When we start to grow in our humility, we start to truly see other people. A mistake we can make, it doesn't mean we don't care for ourselves at all. I think sometimes when we hear, especially that last little scripture passage, we can sometimes get caught up on like, don't care for me, just care for everyone else. No, that's not what Paul's saying. He's basically saying, care for yourself so that you can better care for others. If I care for myself, I'm a far better father for my kids. If I care for myself, I'm a better husband to Courtney. If I care for myself, I'm a better friend to everyone here. And Jesus modeled that kind of self-care. Often throughout the Gospels, it is written that he would go off and pray. I want to tell you right now, that was self-care. Because he knew he could care for other people if he was connected with God. If he took those times for connection with God, that meant he did better in caring and ministering to the people around him. Us too. We can do better. That's why we sing we did sing it today, but we pray the Our Father. Your will be done. Give us this daily bread. Give us what we need for today. Deliver us from evil. Forgive us of our trespasses, so that we can forgive those. We can't do it without you. Humility helps us to see others, help us to do what we want to do for others. It becomes the foundation. Christopher Hutchinson speaks this. He says, I believe humility to be the very heart of Christian faith, even to be the best paradigm of all proper thought regarding God, oneself, and others. He goes on to say this. Humility is an admirable trait, something that polishes all the other assets. It becomes the foundation for kindness. It becomes the foundation. And if you watch the video coming out on Thursday, Pastor Ron and I talk about this. It becomes the foundation for generosity, which is another group identity. It becomes the foundation for patience and serving. Because it allows us to see other people, to see their worth, to see them for who they are. I want to leave you with this as we come to an end here. Richard Foster, he wrote this and is reflecting on weaknesses, thinking about weaknesses. And he said, it's not so much about reflecting on our weaknesses that grows our humility, which I think sometimes we can focus on. So it's not so much about reflecting on our weaknesses that grows humility. We need to be aware of them, but it's not about reflecting on them. What grows humility is by remembering God's goodness and love. Humility comes when we experience God's goodness and superabundant love. That's where our focus is. Let's pray. Lord, I just thank you so much that you modeled humility. Lord, I am so sorry where I haven't. But thank you for your model. Thank you for your love. Help us be a people who are humble. Help us grow in that. Help us be aware of our weaknesses, not to beat ourselves up, but to see places where we grow. Help us see any malfunctions and wrongs we have done. Again, not at a place to knock ourselves down, but to feel what we need to feel and to healthily process through those things. Lord, help us to be grateful for where we are successful, where we have strengths and giftings. I'm grateful that you've put people in our lives to help develop those things and practice those things. And Lord, help us be able to see all of those around us, to see their value. Not in how they can be helpful to us, but just that they are valuable in and of themselves. In your mighty name, Jesus. Amen.